Malaysia Futures 2023 agenda continues, ladies and gentlemen, with a very special session now. This will be in conversation with Professor Dr. Danny Quah, who is the Shing Professor in Economics and Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS, Singapore. Now, this hour focuses aptly on growth and welfare, policymaking in emerging economies, and will be moderated by Dr. Soraya Ismail, Director of Research, KRI, Malaysia. May I now kindly invite the both of them to go on stage and take their seats. Allow me also, as our esteemed moderator and panelists settle in, to give a brief introduction. Professor Dr. Danny Quah is the Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics and Dean at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. His research on inequality, income mobility characterizes the range of experiences across economies to suggest that a single narrative on inequality is unlikely to be correct or helpful. His work on world order takes an economic approach to international systems, studying the supply and demand of world order. What international system does the world superpower wish to provide, and what world order does the global community need? On that note, of course, their 60-minute conversation will also include the opportunity for audience Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly please, of course, do use Slido as we have been. Dr. Soraya Ismail will also be directing your queries towards Professor Dr. Danny Quah towards the end of this hopefully hour-long session. On that note, Dr. Soraya Ismail, without further ado, I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tamina, for introducing Prof. Danny Quah. And Prof. Danny, thank you so much for taking the time from your busy schedule to come and have a conversation with us here in LSE KRI SIAC Malaysia Futures, as well as with all the virtual participants that we have today. I'll straight away go with the topic that we are going, ask questions on the topic that we'll be discussing today, which is growth and welfare, policy making in emerging economies. But as you know, we are also having the background or context of geopolitics. So if I may, I'll just ask a question, the first question to Danny. We have been living in a perceptively unipolar world since the end of the Cold War, but China's emergence as a global superpower, along with its alliances, suggests an emerging bipolarity. Do you think it's preferable to maintain the status quo that has governed the world up until this point? Or will the emergence of a bi- or multipolar world will prove more beneficial to us, the emerging economies?
Thank you, Soraya. And first of all, thank you for having me at this wonderful event. It's been truly enjoyable hearing all the different viewpoints on the great challenges that we're facing. On your question in particular, Soraya, I really like the way you've posed it. I think that we outside have many discussions about geopolitics, whether actually in small dinners in Bangsa or on world stage talking about all kinds of things. And geopolitics is something that's become so consequential for many of us. In those discussions about geopolitics, my feeling is we often miss the point. We talk about all the things that we read going on. What's America going to do? What's China going to do? What's the role of the European Union? Will India become a kingmaker or a spoiler? And we talk about all those grand issues. The way that you've begun this conversation, it seems to me, strikes exactly the right tone, which is, what does that mean for us? It's great that we put so much time and energy as interlocutors, thinking, writing op-eds, commentaries on what the great powers, the Americas and Chinas will do. But unless we drill down on what it means for us, we're not going to get a really good understanding of where we go next. And your question also points the way to not just our thinking about what all this means for us, but where will we go next? what are the forces that are making us go from unipolarity to bipolarity to multipolarity and possibly even more complicated systems of international order. So I thought I would answer your question by saying, I think potentially the way the world is going, for all the scary things that are going on, we could potentially move to a much better place. A much better place for us here in Southeast Asia, a much better place for the world more generally. Now let me very quickly say, not everyone's going to agree with the answer that I've just given. So what I'd like to do is to answer your question, first having answered it in sort of black and white terms, maybe also talk a little bit through a toolkit of ideas so that everyone can plug in their favorite assumptions and come up with your own view about whether this is good for us. Now, the first thing to take up is, as you think about where we're going, you also want to think, what do we want? Do we want a world where America remains the unipolar hegemon? Do we want a world that's bipolar, one pole in the United States, one pole in China, with the associated tensions and conflicts and constant disruptions that we worry about? Is the next disruption in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits going to lead to a global conflagration with tactical nuclear weapons being employed? We worry about that, so we associate that with the transition from unipolarity to bipolarity and more complicated systems. And here, we all need to decide what it is that we want of the international system. For many of us, we're completely comfortable with the idea that America remains the unipolar center, that it is the benevolent hegemon for the rest of the world. And sure, like every benevolent hegemon, it's going to do some things that irritate, infuriate, anger, harm us, because we're small nations. But in the whole, we might decide that's the good thing, and we're willing to tolerate all the inadequacies, all the disruptions that they put into the World Bank or the IMF or the WTO. We'll tolerate that because we feel that there are good things that a benevolent hegemon like the United States can deliver to us. My conversations with people is that often it's the older generation who feel very comfortable with an America-centered international system. And why is that? Some of the greatest statesmen in Asia who reflect on this are also people who've lived through the experiences of the last war.
Yeah.
They've seen how horrible and miserable war was for us in Southeast Asia. Many of us haven't lived through that. We shouldn't presume to tell them that they're wrong. What they lived through is very real to them. What those people saw was also how America, through its reconstruction efforts, allowed the rebuilding, like a phoenix from ashes, of the Japanese economy, allowed the rise of ASEAN, allowed the development of the newly industrializing economies. And many of us are grateful to that, or we ought to be, if we acknowledge that. And that was a time when, the word hegemon actually means benevolent. It means a benevolent leader. So when today we say benevolent hegemon, we're betraying how we don't think about America that way. We think that there are different kinds of hegemons. There are evil hegemons and there are benevolent ones. Well, actually the word hegemon means benevolent. But over the course of the 20th century, writers like Lenin, Noam Chomsky, and others constantly drummed into us the idea that hegemon meant imperialism. Some of us think globalization means imperialism. But in its original sense, it means simply a benevolent leader. Now, when you say, yeah, well, that was the past, and we are respectful of the past, we're respectful of the great statesmen of Asia who thought that way. But we also see that's no longer the way the world is now. The rise of China has put a whole different dynamic to it. And the way that I think many scholars think about the conundrum that you put to us is they say, well, we moved from a world where there was a benevolent hegemon and that the world was more stable as a result of that, to a world where in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, we think of there being a trade-off between America providing a security umbrella, playing the same roles that the elder statesmen of Asia reflected on our coming out of the Second World War. But now there's a different pole of economic growth. It used to be that when America played the role of benevolent hegemon, not only did it provide security, it also provided a large market for us to trade with. America is no longer the provider of a large market for us to trade with. Instead, it is China. So now we see a separation of the role of benevolent hegemon into two different possibilities. And so for us, the trade-off is, do we want to go with a new world of economic growth, prosperity, attendant with all the possible hazards? Or do we stick with the hegemon that we know and love, that has changed, that's no longer necessarily so benevolent in its talk about making America great again, in its talk about friendshoring, in its talk about sometimes excluding us from its meetings of like-minded democratic allies? It's a different world. So when I answered your question, I feel we could be transitioning to a better world, is because I have placed a bet that for many of us still, economic prosperity, the reduction of poverty in our part of the world, the improvement in the ability of us to control our own destiny, that we're able to control our environment, comes from looking in a different direction than the traditional hegemon. But many people will disagree. You know, my elders and betters in Singapore, Malaysia, and elsewhere would say, you young whippersnappers, you forget what life was like, and you forget what America did to save us. I say, I don't forget, but we need to constantly recalculate that trade-off. So my calculation of that trade-off is, the way ahead is much more balanced. But actually, Soraya, I would like us to consider the possibility that the balance continues to shift, and it shifts even more. It should shift between not just those who provide the international system, not just who provide hegemonic rule, benevolent rule, but to a system that is ever more respectful of what we want. In other words, think not just about the supply of the international system, whether it's a unipolar, monopolistic supplier, or a bipolar, multipolar, oligopolistic supplier, but think about a model of where those nations supply an international system, and we are on the demand side of that international system. And we need to express what it is that we want out of that international system. So your question, Soraya, the way it got me thinking as we were sitting here, is that it points the way to something that's potentially quite good. An international system that's not just unipolar or bipolar or multipolar, focusing on the supply side of world order, but to a system that is respectful of the demand side, us. And by us, there were some questions earlier this morning as the international systems, what should we in Malaysia do? Or when I've been in conversations in Singapore, it's been, what should we in Singapore do? And I think that's the right first step. But we should be thinking about something broader. America and China, for all the great powers that they are, they're not the democratic majority of the world. We, the rest of the world, are still 80% of humanity. And if the world had any claim to providing an international system that's legitimate, it needs to pay attention to what we want, to what your question is pointing. That's my answer, and I hope that others will plug in their assumptions and give us different answers as well. This is not to say that the way ahead will be easy. Far from it. We're still so mired in all ways of thinking. We're mired in how we think whatever the international system is, it's got to come out of a conflict between America and China. Will America win? Will China win? And then whoever wins, we will accept. That's the wrong model. The right model is they need to pay attention to what we want. We need to figure out a way to articulate and express what it is that works best for us. And I think we can do that. I hope that in the course of our conversation, we can explore such mechanisms.
Thank you, Danny. That's a very interesting way of framing the question, because it then brings back to the idea of a collective of the rest of the world. So the way you describe the politics of international order seems to be of the supply of the international order, be it unipolar, multipolar, or bipolar. That seems to be the way in which we should look at it, and there's the demand for it. Okay, say for example, I'll go with your hypothesis. Well, this may perhaps characterize the broad global picture. Do you think like states in the global south, the smaller states?
Yeah, like us.
And in Western Europe,
Yeah.
which manifests a whole range of developmental stages, should be concerned in that international system, or should they not be focusing on their domestic or regional concerns, which have a direct impact on their citizens? Why do I bring it up? Because sometimes by not doing anything, you're also asserting our own position in
Yes.
global affairs.
Exactly. By not doing anything, we're accepting the system. And not only that, we are subverting our very legitimate needs and wants to the geopolitics of great powers. We're subverting what we want to serving what the great powers themselves want. And I think that, often we blindly go into this discussion of geopolitics, not recognizing our own agency. And by the way, when I say we do that, I mean the collective we. Malaysia, Singapore, Western Europe, everyone. I mean, Western Europe caves in when America says, no, you've got to go this way, and they follow along. And it's 2,000 years of intellectual and political history that we're battling here. I mean, many people, to carry forward the theme that you've set for us, many people will think of the word Thucydides, and they know, oh, there's this Thucydides trap that we've all been reading about, that Graham Allison, the Harvard political scientist, has described for us how, as America is the reigning superpower, as China rises, when China gets within 80% reach of America, the possibility for conflict arises, and then the rest of us, we lie back and accept that outcome. Right? And this is a thinking that is 2,000 years old, because Thucydides said not just that. He also said, the great powers do what they will, the rest of us suffer what we must. And that thinking completely denies that we, the rest of the world, actually might want to have a say in that outcome. Look, in ASEAN, we're always going on about ASEAN centrality. Right? ASEAN centrality is the idea that what happens in ASEAN cannot be something that's decided for us from the outside. We in ASEAN have to have a say in that. I'm proposing third nation centrality. Those nations that are neither of the great powers, the United States nor China, should assert that the world, 80% of humanity, says, stop behaving like small children. Stop picking about your values versus somebody else's values. Stop trying to pick fights. Because you might want to do that, because then you get bragging rights as the number one nation. But we're not going to go along with it. We're not going to subvert the legitimate needs and wants of our own people to serve at the altar of great power geopolitics. We're going to not do that anymore. So we have to reject that Thucydides idea in favor of third nation centrality. Now, there will be those, many of my colleagues, for instance, who are real dyed-in-the-wool international relations scholars, Although I'm an economist at the Lee Kuan Yew School, I have wonderful colleagues who are steeped in international relations scholarship. And they say, look, it's just, Thucydides is a fact of life. That the great powers do what they will, the rest of us suffer what we must. That is the way of the world, and you have to follow that. But part of the research that I've been doing at the Lee Kuan Yew School is to try and document how actually that's not the way of life. There are many examples of when third nations, not third world nations, we have to rid ourselves of the idea of third world nations. Third nations, nations that are not the United States nor China, have been able to draw a line in the sand and then gotten the great powers to go along with us. Okay? And so here's some examples. The Ottawa Treaty on the control of landmines. This was something that came into being by a collection of third nations, including, of course, Canada, leading the way on seeking to ban the use and production, deployment of landmines across the world. The great powers looked at that and said, look, you're just a bunch of third nations. I've read my Thucydides. I know you can't do anything to me. But as of a year ago, 2 years ago, none of the United States, China, Russia, nor Pakistan, nor a number of other large nations with nuclear weapons, not even just landmines, refused to sign on to the Ottawa Accord. But last year, Joe Biden did. And presumably, as time goes on, there will be pressure for the other great powers to give a little bit on landmines. Human rights, understanding of human rights in the world came out of an agreement between third nations, non-aligned nations in the first place. The anti-colonialism accords that came out from an earlier era were pushed by third nations, not the great powers. In Thucydides' time itself, we all remember, thanks to Graham Allison and the international relations writers, that Thucydides' time was a time of conflict between Athens and Sparta, and the great powers duked it out, and then the rest of the city-states, Greek city-states, suffered the consequences. But actually, 10 years after the Athens-Sparta-Peloponnesian War, Thebes laid waste to Sparta. Thebes, one of the third nations, after biding its time, taking on the dictates of a no longer benevolent hegemony, decided to get some other city-states together, and they laid waste to Sparta. So I suggest that the great powers, for all what they will now in determining whether the world is unipolar or bipolar, needs to pay attention to what third nations want. Now, we might then say, well, in ASEAN, we have difficulty articulating what we want. What is it that third nations would want? If we got a seat at the table with the United States and China, and we say we've had it with the whole unipolar, bipolar narrative, doesn't work for us anymore, what do we want? They're very reasonable things that we want. Same things that ASEAN wants. National sovereignty, territorial integrity, freedom from foreign interference, multilateralism, a level playing field, open markets. There's a whole list of things that work for us, unify us, and that we ought to be organizing the discussion around. So, your question about how we third nations pay attention to what our people want, that's right in line with your first question, which is it time as the world shifts? How does that affect us? It affects us in that we need to start thinking about exercising agency. We need to think about how the great powers need to behave in a way that's elastic to what we want. If in ASEAN, we continue to mouth the words ASEAN centrality, but we never actually do anything about it, that's shameful. It's shameful for us, and it tells us that we have been pursuing a verbal narrative that we're not prepared to stand behind. So I say stand for ASEAN centrality and stand for third nation centrality. That's how we're going to try and shift the world and the international system in the right order.
So that we have a say in what's going on.
We have a say in what's going on.
What's going on. Thank you, Danny. That's very insightful. I'm mindful of the time. We have about 35 minutes. So we talk about the background and we articulate a new way in us thinking on how to benefit from this new supply of international system. But coming back to policy making at individual countries, I know we have a discussion about a collective and having that collective agency. I think we can come back to what are the specific mechanism for that. But before we go into the specific mechanism of a collective third nation, I'll just go back to what binds us. What binds us? So now, if I look at, let's look at policy making, because Kara have to do policies, okay? Okay, China is a communist country, while the US is democratic. I'm still going there, sorry, this is for elaboration of example. The policies in both countries reflects their vastly different ideologies and values. Now, even Lee Kuan Yew, during the Asian Tiger years, reflect that the values inherent or unique to our society, say, for example, culture, religion, as a key determinant of why policies attain some success in the individual implementation. Now, thinking about that and thinking about the collective and the different value or cultural systems we might inherit, do you think that quote-unquote way of looking at the world remains relevant in our public discourse over agency that you mentioned and over developmental initiatives?
Yeah, thank you. That really does get to the nub of a lot of these issues. Part of the reason that we, as a collection of third nations, feel so disunited is we are torn, and our people are torn. This theme of how great power conflict is not just about security umbrella, economic primacy. It goes back to something quite fundamental, values that we carry. And I like the way you said it, that the narrative out there is one of the United States being a democracy, China being a communist country. And so if we make a choice on the unipolarity, bipolarity, multipolarity spectrum, are we also putting our values on the line? And I want to argue that we're not. We're not going to do that. And and there might be an accusation that I'm being naive in that. But let me elaborate what I mean by that. The idea that this great power conflict between two sides of the world goes back to values is a narrative that actually began in the 1960s, the first Cold War.
The Cold War,
if this is the second Cold War, that was the first Cold War.
Yes.
And it was John F. Kennedy addressing his nation. And what he was doing was he was channeling a German philosopher, Hannah Arendt.
Yes.
Hannah Arendt talked about how this was the final struggle of humanity between democracy and freedom on the one hand and totalitarianism and tyranny on the other. And JFK channeled this into the great twilight struggle of our time, the United States versus the Soviet Union. Democracy and freedom versus totalitarianism and tyranny.
Rambo came out.
Yeah, exactly. Now, let me say, when we phrase the problem that way, that's very little choice. Who would put up their hands and say, oh, okay, I've listened to what you have to say, John. I'm going to go the way of totalitarianism and tyranny. Nobody would do that. Framing the problem in that way removes the possibility for intelligent debate. Intelligent debate has got to be not along the description of those values, but what different systems deliver to their people. And let me make the bold claim that actually all of us want the same thing. We all want greater control over our own destiny. Every single one of us. I challenge you to find someone who says they don't want that. All of us want greater control over our own destiny. All of us want space that those who come after us, the next generation or our offspring, can continue to improve in well-being, can continue to expand that control of their destiny. So the right way to think about the choice on this, which system delivers that? The right answer is none, neither. Both of those systems are problematic. Where America might have a system that says we prioritize individual personal freedoms. However, it is also the society where culture wars are now rife, the opiate epidemic is brutal, there is violence in the street, gun violence, racial enmity, infrastructure is crumbling, the economy is no longer able to stand on its own, instead it needs industrial policy. I mean, that's not actually delivered a lot of good to their people. America is the only major economy in the world that over the 80s and 90s, even as the economy grew overall, the bottom 40% of their population actually grew poorer. Not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms. The strongest, most powerful country in the world had a bottom 40% that immiserized on growth. I love the United States. I grew up there. I grew to maturity there as a student. It gave me a job. It gave me tools to analyze the United States. I am forever grateful to it. But the view that America is a system whose values, culture, and organization is a universalist panacea for the world, and therefore America is legitimate in enforcing that system on others, even through regime change, is just totally wrong. Totally wrong. This is not to say that we should all bow down and proclaim the People's Republic of China as our grand overmaster. Far from it. China has issues. China has issues. America has issues. We need to carve our own way. And we need to assert that the system that's built going forwards should not be hegemonic to the extent that all the rest of us have to go one way or the other. So my reaction to this, democracy and freedom versus communism, totalitarianism, and tyranny, is that that's a false dichotomy. And the narrative out there, which you very carefully described, the narrative out there, is one that we need to reject. We need to find our own way. Each of our nation has faults. Each of our nation has strengths. The question is what works for us. Having gone that way, let me also be cautious. Sometimes it is not the right thing to listen too much to your own people. Let me be very careful about how I say that. Okay, let me give an example on this. Part of the reason the world has been so successful for the last 70 years is that we began to build an idea, even under benevolent hegemony, of the international system as a community of nations, behaving like they were individual people, interacting with each other under a reign of law that attracted consent of the governed and the organized approval of humanity. That was the world that we tried to build, a liberal, international, rules-based order, which everyone subscribes to, except the architect of that world. The great power that built that world has begun to pull away from that. And going back 70 years, when that world began to be constructed, its people did not go along with that. The words that I just used, consent of the governed, the organized thinking of those that they're under reign of law, a community of nations interacting as if they were people, those words are Woodrow Wilson's words. Woodrow Wilson attempted to build a League of Nations that would be this international system that respected all of us. Guess who most strongly rejected that world, that vision? The American people. The American people said, we will not go along with you in constructing such a world. So when the League of Nations was born, America was not part of the League of Nations because America's people rejected that. Now, that was an instance when all of the world's leadership said, it'd be great if you were on board, but this is such a compelling idea coming out of a war that has devastated all of our economies, killed hundreds of millions of our own people. We need to move forwards from there. So sometimes you gotta do what leadership demands of you. Do the right thing, even if it means working really hard to bring your people around, convincing them otherwise.
Wow, look at that. Interesting conversation. I think Do we have any questions on Slido before I go on with Danny? If not, I'd like to ask a bit more on this the
Actually, can I just add to
Yes,
that?
yes.
Because I talked about how I felt I might have been a bit unfair. I talked a lot about how, we've got questions, but maybe I'll just finish this. Oh, there's an
Yes.
excellent first question.
Yes, I wanted to put that in.
Okay, so let me pick up, I was being a bit unfair, picking on the United States. Let me pick on China. Because I said America can be a dangerous place. If you're a black person in the urban city, driving around at night, if you run a stoplight and the police car pulls up next to you, it is a dangerous place to be, right? That's something that's happened over and over. China is not necessarily a very safe place. China has seen tens of millions of its people killed on its own streets.
Yes.
Scores of millions have been exiled, purged, outed by their family and friends for being insufficiently loyal to the nation. There was a time when, China wasn't exporting iPhones. The one thing that China exported for a long time was socialist revolution. None of the rest of us wanted to buy that. But we were all worried that that was the China that would grow. That's not China today. But China has had its own dalliance with a difficult episode in history. Just like America is going through a difficult period now, we've got to have faith that the best of humanity will come through. The humanity in China has shown through in how it trades with the rest of the world, talks about win-win outcomes, believes firmly in national sovereignty and territorial integrity, refuses to intervene in other nations. America is quite the opposite of that at this point, but America proclaims universality of its set of values. We're going through a peculiar period in history.
It is peculiar because some in the audience, and I think being maybe a devil's advocate, some might say that your thoughts on how China does FDI, I mean, they do go in, they do want certain things. And therefore, that is not really the case. And as well as America, when they go in, they want something too.
Absolutely. I've been bullied. I've been in meetings with Chinese officials where I'm clearly being bullied, and I do not believe that that's the only forum where such kind of behavior happens in negotiations. So I am familiar with that. I've tried to set up small businesses in China, and I know of the barriers and obstacles. So I'm not going into this naive and dewy-eyed, but I do think that at the end of it all, the question is, we need to navigate a world of trade-offs. And the trade-offs that we navigate need to be cleared out of an underbrush of historical legacy, and we need to carry forward our discussion in a data-driven, empirically grounded way. That's what I try to do now. I'm happy to take questions, or we can keep talking. I leave it to you. You're the hegemon. You tell me why.
Benevolent, of course. It is already intrinsic in that term, yes. Do you want to tackle your own question, Danny?
Yes. Okay, so this was a question that I asked Robert Wade earlier this morning. Robert gave us a wonderful narrative on the state of the world and the state of the United States. In fact, my reading is Robert continued a similarly informative, wonderful discussion that came from Jomo yesterday morning. There was an accurate enumeration listing of the difficulties and challenges that we face, given what the great powers do. So what do I think the rest of us should do? So since I posed this question, I've had a bit of time to think about what an answer might be. I think that the wrong answer would be for each of us, whether it's Malaysia, Singapore, the United Kingdom, or even huge chunks of Germany or France, to say, this is what I'm going to do. There is strength in numbers. When I said that third nations are 80% of humanity, I did not say Singapore is 80% of humanity. I mean, the collection of third nations ASEAN is a force to be reckoned with if we are unified and telling a consistent ASEAN narrative. Each of the rest of us in ASEAN, even the largest of us, the Indonesians, the Thailands, the Philippines, are not as strong as ASEAN taken all together. So first thing I think the rest of us should do, get a Bandung 2.0 process going. In 1955, the non-aligned nations of the world, at that time just 46 of us, far smaller than the group of third nations today, far diminutive in the economic footprint that we had. Nonetheless, in 1955, Indonesia, India, bunch of nations got together and said, these are the things that we believe. We want to be distant from the Cold War conflict that's emerging between the great powers. It's not our battle. Bandung principles laid out that we should not, the rest of the world, should not be drawn by defense agreements into taking one side or the other in that conflict. We want to determine our own destiny. We want to be able to trade. We want certain basic understandings, human rights, no colonialism, multilateralism, rule of law, level playing field, open market. We want certain things that all of us can agree we want to have. I think if we formed a Bandung 2.0, the rest of the world would actually listen now more than they did 70 years ago. And we can actually put together concrete steps going forward. We're following the footsteps of the Ottawa Arms Control Treaty, of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, of the injection of human rights and respect for other nations into China's constitution through India's intervention. The whole list of historical examples that we can now feed into Bandung 2.0, which we did not have in Bandung 1.0. I think there's lots that we can do. I'm happy to start to put together such a group. I would call it the Bukit Timah Protocols, because the Lee Kuan Yew School sits in Bukit Timah. So we would begin a conversation. And Bukit Timah is not a nation. It doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's not going to threaten anybody. Just like Bandung. We can have a Bandung 2.0. We could begin a sensible discussion of what the next international system should be. We can stop just complaining about the terrible things the international system does and actually do something about it. I propose that we bring together a Bandung 2.0 working group.
Yes, yes. Okay, that I think answers
the second question.
Second question. How do we have power to have a say in the bargaining with US and China? No more. We do a collective action. We do Bukit Timah 2.0.
Bukit Timah 2.0. And this doesn't mean that we have to agree to everything.
Yes, of course.
We're not saying world government will be determined, everything will follow just one ruler. We agree on what is common ground. And there's a lot of common ground, and we need to put that on the table. Right now, we're not. We're running around like a chicken with its head cut off because we're constantly being asked, do you want to choose China or the United States? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what works for us?
Yes. Okay. Wait, let me just go for the what if, not in your opinion, come after, okay, never mind. Let's sorry to do this, I'm exercising my hegemonic power. What if both US and China doesn't want to listen to your Bukit Timah, to the 80% of the world? How does third nation move forward from there? I mean, you might be talking all day long. Nobody wants to listen to you, Prof.
Yeah, and I can guarantee pretty much that's going to happen. US and China will say, we're not going to listen to you. But here's the thing. The narrative of power has moved away from the blind exercise of assertive power. Right? Power used to be thought of as, I've got the power, I've got the military, I've got the weapons on my side, I will make you do what I want. The global narrative has moved well away from that. And there are many examples along the way. Take soft power, American soft power. One of the ways in which America thought it was going to continue the American century, continue American hegemony, was this wonderful idea of the Harvard political scientist Joe Nye. He said, America's true strength, yes, it lies in its weapons, its missiles, its aircraft carrier groups, all of that undoubtedly, the strength of the economy. But the real strength of America is its soft power. its attractiveness to the rest of the world. How America has been able to bring all of you from the rest of the world to come study
Yes.
at our universities. Why all of you watch Hollywood movies, listen to Taylor Swift, drink Coca-Cola, all the critical ingredients of American soft power. We give America approbation by buying the things that it sells us. We give it endorsement and approval by agreeing, and through doing that, we increase its power. Soft power is the handing of agency from the originator of that power to its recipients. Soft power was such a wonderful idea because it said, we are so confident, we will hand over to you to decide whether you want to come with us. Right? And we all did that in spades. For the last 50 years, all of us have been doing that. Soft power is the handing over of agency to third nations. And every now and then, regretfully, America has lost its soft power handling, and then what's it done? It's sent out drones to kill people. It's bombed entire tracts of humanity. And in doing that, it's realized, it's radicalized those geographies against it. It's no longer a world where you can bomb a population into submission. The world has shifted. And third nations have a great deal more agency and influence, and great powers are a lot more elastic than we used to think. But give face, lah. Don't rub it in their noses. Don't go to them and say, okay, now you are beholden to me. You must give me multilateralism. Play the game. Play the diplomacy game. Play the discussion. And we will be able to assert our agency.
Thank you, Prof. So that's a question. I got a question from Tim Burnell, but I remembered we were talking about the power of language, the seduction of language. When you, for example, last time we had the recession, we call it credit crunch. All this wordplay, and then after that, the principles behind it do make an impact on how society think about things. And when society think about things in a different way, things will move, as you say, Prof. Soft power. So now Tim is asking, you have mentioned several times about narratives being quote unquote out there. Aren't you, or we, also reshaping the narratives? But that's what?
The quick answer, Tim, is yes.
Yes.
Yes, we are. But I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that if the world does need to go the way of competing narratives, the choice is not to retreat from competition in narratives. The choice is to do even better in shaping a narrative that is clearly grounded in doing good for humanity. This is what, I mean, we might object to what Greta Thunberg has tried to do on the global climate crisis. But there's no question that through her actions, she has activated, exercised, mobilized huge swaths of the population out there that would not have just listened. I mean, Al Gore continues to tell the story. He was just on TV this morning telling the same story about an inconvenient truth. But Greta Thunberg, however much I might disagree with some of her tactics, has shifted the narrative, has moved the needle, and in a positive direction for action on the global environment. And that's not a bad thing. We always need to have checks and balances, but we've got to play the game. So that would be how I would approach this. I mean, it's like Tai Chi, the martial art. Using Tai Chi to win a confrontation does not mean you renounce the use of martial arts to defeat an opponent. But you make it less obvious, and you come up with a winning strategy that's less damaging to everything around you. That's no bad thing.
And I don't want to fight you for that because I know you have a black belt in karate.
No,
Yes.
no, taekwondo.
Taekwondo, there you are. Sorry. I think we'll take one more question before I would like you to give a wrap up as well, Prof, because it's very important for us to really take some key, sorry to use that word, key takeaways that would benefit all of us here in condensing what you've mentioned today. I would like to go for, again, exercising my power. Even emerging countries today face hung election results. Very few command of the lower houses. Sorry, where is it now?
Yeah.
Did I just got, sanitized? No? Okay, never mind. Wait. How can the 80%, face hung, very few command of the lower houses? What creative policy making techniques do you foresee emerging? If you don't want to answer this, it's fine.
I'm fine answering that. Our political systems are not perfect, to say the least. There are in some very mature democracies that ought to be setting examples for all of us emerging democracies, the system's positively dysfunctional.
Yeah.
They're mired in paralysis. No positive actions have been taken. There is grandstanding over issues that are far from from top priority. You quibble over small things that advance your party or your colleagues at the expense of the nation, and that's not a good look. Nations that do not practice electoral democracy can sometimes run the risk of, as we were discussing earlier, of riding roughshod over what their people want, and then we still need checks and balances. But there's a whole middle ground of nations between these two that attempt to work with what they have. America and other parts of the transatlantic democracies, used to trumpet how they were liberal democracies. That's what made them work. But you could argue, as Fareed Zakaria and others have done, that there's been a transmogrification of them into becoming illiberal democracies. And that's not good either. There are nation states that historically have been called authoritarian, but now show every sign of being responsive to what their people want. Even the Economist newspaper calls some of us now responsive authoritarian states. We're better than we used to be. We're responsive to the people. And so we need a balance on that front, but we also need leadership and governance. The democracies that work are not passive, representative democracy conduits that every 2 weeks put up a policy for referendum and then we go with what the majority says. That's not a functioning democracy. Even democracies between electoral cycles practice a bit of authoritarian control, leadership. And what we need is to build a citizenry, a media sector, a journalism sector, NGO sector, civil society that is aware of the grand challenges that all societies face, engage in open debate, open, robust debate, and every now and then will come to a point where they cannot agree. But leadership will then have to step in and say, you are divided. This is how I've taken the balance into account, and I will cast the breaking vote. I will break the tie. That is something that we respect. That is a process for decision-making that we respect everywhere. We use that to set monetary policy in nations that have monetary policy committees. We use that in governing boards of large corporations. When Steve Jobs had a disagreement with his governing board, his advisory board, management board, he went the way that his leadership instincts told him he should. And I think having a whiff of leadership together with a responsive, robust, vibrant, discussing polity is a pretty good way to go. But we've got to have both. We can't be constructing political systems that are passive conduits for representative democracy votes every fortnight. That way lies madness.
I think if I were to sum up what makes, coming back to our growth and welfare policy making in emerging economies, I would, if I may, Prof, sum up to that we must have that leadership to be decisive, but at the same time, having a well discussed, well educated, as well as an open media, public discussion, public intellectuals coming in and not be just co-opted into a popularity contest, but doing the right things.
Yeah, and not give in to, if I continue that, not give in to the politics of identity, which draws on decades of history, rather than the grand challenges that face us today.
That's right.
And we need to take that forward. And I think, look, we've got the opportunity here. Southeast Asia has breathing room at this point. We've got a good story on how we're experimenting with different political systems. We've got good growth prospects. We continue to navigate carefully great power geopolitics, and we've got to keep to that journey, be respectful of what others want, but be assertive about the things that work for us. And I think that's the way we should be going.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, may I have a round of applause for Professor Dr. Danny Quah. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suraya and Prof. Dr. Danny. That was eye-opening as it was sobering, but at the same time with plenty of actionable takeaways for policymakers in emerging economies. Dr. Suraya, Prof. Danny, would you kindly remain on stage briefly as Dr. Suraya will do a quick token of appreciation and hand it over to you right now. Thank you, everyone. Please bear with us. Thank you again, Prof. Dr. Danny and Dr. Suraya.